When the House was suspended, it was government business, and to that we shall return. Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, it can truly be said that this House just received before lunch what was easily described as one of the worst estimate presentations ever since independence. I really indicated last night that the political games had begun and the circus is back in town. And David Copperfield is under the big tent. And I intend to show today, early on, why the people of Barbados ought truly to be disturbed at a Minister of Finance who changes measurements and comparative analyses speech by speech such that numbers can look good. But what we had more than anything else today from this Minister of Finance can be described as bombast, bluster, and even blundering when he became the only Minister of Finance in the history of the country to try to extract amortization from revenue. That is what Barbados has been reduced to. And it is a sad thing, ma'am, because after the bombast and the bluster and the attempt to try to paint a rosy picture, the average Barbadian out there is entitled to ask some questions. If things are so rosy, and if things are presenting themselves in a way that all of these successes are being bestowed upon the country, why is the ordinary Barbadian, individual, family, business, continuing to face the worst times of their life? And by every measurement, this government has failed, especially according to their own measurements. And I intend today to take my time and to go through many of these things, because it is easy to come in here, and clearly I apologize if we offset the Minister of Finance with our comments this weekend, because he spent half his speech seeking to respond to them. And then when he reached the point on economic data, he literally ran it like if he was going around the garrison, or like if he was Usain Bolt making a guest appearance at the National Stadium, such that a person could not follow what he was saying once he came to anything approaching and approximating economic and financial data. But we have come to expect these things from the Honourable Minister. And while I don't intend to spend a lot of time on figures in here today, I need to start with really and truly what he started with, and what really needs to be debunked from the start. Because I suspect that there are innocent members in this Honourable Assembly who have not realized what the Minister sought to do. And the first thing was to suggest that he had so succeeded in being able to bring the deficit down to 4.2%, when in truth and in fact, ma'am, this minister, in all of his previous presentations, including his financial statement and budgetary proposals of 2015, has been speaking to a deficit according to one measurement, and has sought today to come in and use another measurement today, so that Bajans, remembering the numbers alone, would believe that true success has emerged at his hands. And what am I referring to, ma'am? And I take my time, and if necessary, ma'am, I will use a calculator if you allow me. Because clearly, anybody doing it would come to the same conclusion. I want to quote from page 22 of the Honourable Minister of Finance's statement last year, where he said these words: referring to the previous year. The deficit of $592.1 million represents 6.8% of GDP at market prices of $8.7 billion. Using the IMF accounting method, the deficit is calculated at 6.6% of GDP. The deficit in the corresponding period of 2013-14 was 11.6% of GDP. Now, ma'am, there are three different measurements in here, and two which this House is accustomed hearing from this Minister of Finance and previous Ministers of Finance. And I really want members just to take the time, because it is important to understand what this minister did today when he kept referring to negative operating balances and a deficit of 4.2%, when in truth and in fact, in his own estimates that we are debating at page 2, the figure of 6.3%, negative 6.3%, is on the basis of the IFI's, International Financial Institutions basis, and in fact represents a figure of 6.3%, but is premised, and this is the key point, is premised on the government taking in a level of revenue that it has never yet projected that it would take in. So the first simple point to make is that the minister is comparing apples with oranges in reporting to the country. Now, that is not acceptable behavior for in here. And if I were elsewhere, I would have to find a different set of language other than calling him David Copperfield, that Barbadians might more readily relate to, particularly as they traverse through Bridgetown and the markets when people are playing with cards. But being in this honorable House, I will not resort to that kind, I didn't say that, I wouldn't call that kind of language to describe any member in this honorable chamber. But David Copperfield would suffice for now, because you cannot now come at the last minute and change the measurements, trying to suggest that what he said, 11.8% down to 4.2%. 4.2%. And I remember it clearly, because when I looked at the estimate, I said, but this figure here is 6.3. And then I went and worked out how he got the 4.2. He took the negative operating balance of $357.1 million and divided it by the GDP of 89.21. A figure that they don't even put in these estimates for honorable members to consider in a determination and tracking what has happened in every previous year when these estimates have been laid. So into the mix comes a new metric. Into the mix comes a new metric in the hope that Barbadians will only remember the numbers and forget that you're comparing apples with oranges, or more likely, you're comparing apples with flour, because they're so far off. Now I say to you that our comments in relation to these estimates stand. And year by year, year after year, ma'am, we have come to this honorable chamber since 2008, and we said, I'm going to carry you back. We said that the projections were overly optimistic and go beyond the bounds of what is acceptable. And in fact, what ends up happening is that the deficit ended up ballooning because the expenditure was not cut to suit realistic revenue. And that is why, for the first time in this country's history, rather than having a current account deficit, spending more than you are earning as an aberration, as a one-off, like we did in 1962, like we did in 1974, 76, 89, 91. What we have now is the unacceptable situation, Madam Speaker, Deputy Speaker, of this government carrying us and casting in concrete a current account deficit, spending year by year, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, and yet again, 2016. Not putting the country in any position to become fit for purpose and for growth to return. seeing debt accumulating at a rate. We left debt just under $6 billion. And in 7 years, this government has accumulated more debt than the Barbados Labour Party accumulated in 14 years. And that has come from accumulated deficits in part, because debt is only accumulated deficits. You may add other things to debt. But let me carry you through this exercise. Because in 2008, they overestimated revenue by 22%. In 2009-10, they overestimated revenue by 22%. In 2011, they overestimated it by 22 again. In 2012, they overestimated it by 15%. In 2013, 22 again. 2014, 20%. 2015, 22.9%. You know what they want, and this is for February and March alone. They want us to believe that in February of this year and March, that the government is going to raise 30% of its overall revenue in these 2 months. Now, when I relate back to what the actual outturn of revenue was when they kept overestimating February and March, you will begin to see. And even though I will come to talk about the quality of the presentation, these estimates, and the process, because these estimates are full of errors and absent of explanatory notes. But 30 people elected by members of this country to do their business must come in here and deal with paper that is missing all kinds of information. I hope and pray that you could hear a Minister of Finance when he gets to the economic and financial sections moving at 100 miles per hour to gather data that is not even given to you in your hand. But we ain't complaining, we can do our job. And we can do our job, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the people of Barbados are suffering too much under the weight of incompetence and lack of caring and corruption of this government. And I want, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be very clear that this overprojection of revenue in February and March is not something that we are speaking to for the first time this year. But what were the results? In 2008, 2009, this government projected that they would raise $2.694 billion in revenue. Ma'am, you know what they raised? They raised 2.56. They raised $130 million less than what was projected. And virtually every member on this side warned them that it was too optimistic a projection. In 2009-2010, they projected $2.815 billion and raised $2.5, a reduction of $290 million from what they expected to raise, but the expenditure was suited for that optimistic revenue projection. In 2010-11, the difference was $100 million, 2.51 to 2.41. In 2011-12, when they had the least generous projection for February and March of 15%, the overestimation was only $56 million, reinforcing the point that I'm making in here today, that these estimates are predicated upon false assumptions. In 2012-13, they projected they would raise $2.62 billion. They raised $240 million less at 2.427. In 2013-14, they projected they would raise $2.649 billion. They raised almost, Madam Deputy Speaker, $350 million less at $2.408 billion. And 2014-15, they projected $2.54 billion and raised $120 million less at $2.422. And now this year, all of a sudden, that is over $1 billion in over projections of revenue since 2008 by this government. No wonder this country is in the state in which it is, because the revenue is the basis upon which they then compare what expenditure they can accommodate. And even in going for deficits that were unsustainable, the situation became worse because the government failed to come to reality with the revenue which was there. And it led to the largest infliction of taxation by any government, starting in 2008, continuing in 2010, 2011, 2013, 2014, 2015. And the people of Barbados are, on average, $8,000 per family worse off because of the additional, per year, worse off because of the additional taxation inflicted on by this government. I say to you, ma'am, that when, therefore, this government tells us that it intends to raise $802 million in February and March, which is $250 million more than it raised in February and March last year, what has happened in the Barbados economy? What has happened in the Barbados economy in February and March of this year that is so uniquely different that will cause this government to raise that kind of money in these 2 months? I accept that the BNTCL sale that we were hearing about since before last election in the 2012 budget of the Minister of Finance, he says that that's going to come. And I'll come to that in a minute. But that is only $75 million according to him. But yet we have investment income listed in the estimates for which there is no explanatory note. And even if we take off that $75 million from the 250, you're left with $175 million more that the government says is going to get in February and March. Well, you know what, Madam Deputy Speaker? Like I said in each year since 2008, we shall wait and see. Because every year that we waited and saw, we saw a ballooning of the deficit. We saw an over-optimism on the revenue translate into a dismal performance. And this government continues to want the country to believe that hope is a strategy. Because year by year we have said to you that these estimates are based on revenue that is hope at best and deception at worst. Well, hope may be a strategy, but deception is a criminal act. And I trust and pray that while the people of Barbados watch on, they appreciate that the actions may be the government's, but the consequences are the people's. The consequences are ours. And we saw the consequences because they refused to reach a position where they confronted reality prior to the last election. And within 6 months of the election, gathered everybody at the Hilton Hotel to unfold the news that the economy was in shambles, and then to inflict a scale of suffering through layoffs, through cuts in allowances, through additional taxation. And then today want to tell us that the sun is shining. That's how you ended off. The sun is shining. The sun is shining for the people at the hospital. The sun is shining for the people who can't get the garbage collect. The sun is shining for the people whose children can't go to the university, or for the children themselves who now have to contemplate a Barbados that their older brothers and sisters or their parents did not have to contemplate, because we guaranteed them a right to be educated free of cost at university prior to this government. And when you add all of these things together, I say to you, on the pure estimates, this continues to be a document in which we can repose no confidence, Madam Deputy Speaker. And let me carry you further to the point, because you can't tell me that you are going to spend $4.239 billion this year, and the minister stuck to these figures, and that you are going to raise 2.668 billion in revenue. The difference is 1.57 billion. And Madam Deputy Speaker, if you took out amortization for this year of $1.6 billion, you left, Madam Deputy Speaker, with 564 million. And if you take 564 million, Madam Deputy, and divide it by the GDP of 8921, what is the miraculous figure that comes up? What is the figure? And children in primary school with a calculator can do this figure and then multiply it by 100. 6.3%. But this minister come in here today and tell us that the deficit can be 4.2, using a measurement that he didn't use in the budget last year, using a measurement different from other ministers of finance, including the former prime minister, all to make a point that he has achieved in bringing something down to 4.2% when the numbers bear out 6.3. And if you use the accountant general's basis, same thing again. And then when you come to next year, oh, we're going to go to 5%. When in truth and in fact, the appropriate measurement on the IFI's basis goes from 6.3 to 7.8. But I want to tell you that I don't accept that the deficit will be 6.3 for the reasons I just gave you on the projection, over projection of revenue. And we still have another $21 million to vote here for the Transport Board, and the last supplementary that we voted as well, another 0.5% of GDP. That carries it to 6.8, and any reduction in revenue can carry it further. But this is what this House is being, and this country is being. And it comes down to tone and behavior, you know, ma'am. I have no interest in commenting on anything about the Minister of Finance other than in the exercise of his public duty. And I'm saying to him that he caused me grave disappointment on a number of issues in the last year. One, we were told when the IMF Article 4 report for 2014, which should have come out in 2015, that we would get it. There was no reason for the country not to receive it. Barbadians, of course, had gotten it every single year, that there was an Article 4 report. Indeed, the other aberration was in 2012, when the Barbados Labour Party remarked that the central bank governor and/or the Ministry of Finance refused to allow the IMF to come to do an Article 4 assessment of the Barbados economy as is required by our agreement with the International Monetary Fund. And we know why now, why they could not let the IMF land in Barbados to do that report in 2012, because the outcome for the elections in 2013 might well have been different, because the truth would have come from a different source. Do you know that in spite of the minister assuring the country that this Article 4 report would come out for 2015, that it is yet to be publicized or distributed, either locally or internationally? And the point that I want to make simply is that we have done more damage to the brand of Barbados by suppressing this report than by people reading a bad report. We have done more damage to the brand of Barbados by suppressing this report than people reading a bad report. And it amazes me how fast and loose we play with this country's reputation. And the rest of the cabinet must stand up and ask the questions. Because the international community will want, naturally, to go to an independent assessment of this economy. And one of the first documents they will go for is the Article 4 report, particularly if we have to go back to the foreign capital markets to raise any bonds. Well, I suppose in spite, they didn't go last year, and the reality is that the newspapers in Barbados and the majority of people in Barbados have even forgotten that the IMF gave a report in 2015. And that the IMF's report in 2015, if we were ever to see it, what would it say about the quality of government's data? I want the Minister of Finance to tell us that. What would it have said about the arrears that this government continues not to bring to book? But the minister can, in a press conference, say, we are going to keep supplementaries down. Well, the easiest way to keep supplementaries down is by not letting them come to Parliament. But that don't mean that the liability not there. And that is why the ministers on the other side have businessmen hurting their ears on a weekly basis about the amount of money that government owes suppliers and businesses, suppliers of goods and services in this country, because the government refuses to bring the liabilities to book. What would the IMF have said? And the media needs to ask the Minister of Finance these questions. The opposition can point the way, but the people believe that the opposition will of necessity be political. Well, don't believe us. Ask the Minister of Finance and get a copy of the report yourself. Because the people of Barbados, for as long as we have had a relationship with the IMF, have had the ability to take the report and read it and make independent judgments. We used to have that confidence in the central bank. But we can't have it anymore because the central bank report has now become propaganda machine number 2. And when you look at the central bank report, we used to get an economic a review of actual data, not editorial commentary about the government, not language designed to be a public relations machine for the Ministry of Finance. This is the same central bank report. Look at it here. I brought it because we have short memories. In September 2014, a central bank economic review under any other previous governor of the central bank used to be a document, a substantive document of data. And we are now having to put up with editorial comment. In 2014, September, what did the governor purport to tell us? That the Barbados economy is firmly set on the path to sustainable growth, led by sectors and activities in which we have a demonstrated comparative advantage. The Barbados economy is forecasted to grow by 2% in 2015 and 2.3% in 2016. Well, the same IMF made the mistake of coming out and saying that it would grow by 0.8%. And they get cursed, like how the lady from Royal Bank get cursed in here today. Using the floor of Parliament to attack people for difference of opinion. Entirely un-Barbadian, entirely unacceptable for any member of this Parliament, far less a Minister of Finance, who must depend on the cooperation and confidence of those in the financial sector to help steer this ship called Barbados safely. Where was the 2% growth that the governor talked about in September 2014? We have to remind people of what passes for commentary in this country. Because every time there's a new speech, it's as if they wipe the hard drive. And they want us to believe these rosy things in a vacuum. Well, as long as there's a Barbados Labour Party, there won't be any belief in a vacuum, because we will hold you accountable. CEB comes out with a different statement. They too become the victim of the minister's tongue. Yesterday, it was bad enough that he went on the back page. And what is the lady saying? That there ought to be a discussion in this country as to our options. That we continue to have a chronic fiscal deficit problem. And that discussion about our options merits mature discussion. And rather than seeing it as a difference of opinion, because nobody can force the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Central Bank to deal with the debt problem in a way that there is almost consensus across the country, including the Minister of Agriculture, who to his credit, has remained steadfast in his position that you cannot pay out 69 or 66 cents. The member for St. Peter's whole speech last year was premised on that you cannot pay out 66 cents in the dollar, 69 cents in the dollar, and expect to stabilize this economy and to bring back growth. And in fairness to the rest of the cabinet, I think they're bewildered, because the presumption of regularity would suggest that the Minister of Finance ought to be correcting the governor. So why is the Minister of Agriculture behaving like a bad boy? Why is the Minister of Agriculture holding his position? Why is the Minister of Agriculture writing letters to the Prime Minister, published in the paper, making the point that we have reached a state in our affairs, whether we agree with him on the solution, and we may not fully, but we agree on the problem. And we agree that we cannot continue to pay 66 cents, 67 cents, whatever it is in the dollar, in debt service, 30 cents in interest alone. And what are the figures and facts? Madam Deputy Speaker, our interest in this country has risen at an astronomical rate under this government. When we left government, the Barbados Labour Party government was paying $342.7 million in interest. This government moved from 342 to 420 to 342 to 435 to 507 to 608 in 2013-14 to 665 in 2014-15 to 695 last year, and this next year coming up from April, we are going to be spending $730 million in interest alone, a figure that is almost the same amount as what the government of Barbados spends in wages, statutory and non-statutory personal emoluments. Do you understand that the same thing we spend to employ 20-something thousand public servants is what we are going to be spending in interest alone? I'm praying to God that the amortization, which is a little less this year, but still in the vicinity of $965 million, praying to God that nobody says, I don't want to roll over my debt. I want full repayment, or I want early repayment. This is where Barbados is. And it comes in here to be politics as usual. Politics as usual. I know what hurts me, Madam Deputy. The last 2 times I spoke in this chamber, I gave the government my blessing on 2 things. I gave the government my blessing on any efforts to deal with public health in this country, because I said it was the second most important thing for a government to deal with after keeping a people safe. And that if the government brought estimates in here that would allow us to treat to 1, sufficient garbage trucks, because we need 35 garbage trucks a year to keep Barbados clean, not the amount that will only buy 3 or 4 or 5, such that we have less than 15 garbage trucks any day functioning properly. And if you get 3 or 4, you might get it up to 20. Just about half of what we need to keep this country safe. But garbage leads to public health problems. I said we would support the starting of a program to remove derelict houses from communities, because derelict houses have not been demolished by the Environmental Protection Health Department now for over 5-6 years. In the dry season, you have problems with rats. In the wet season, you have problems with mosquitoes, chikungunya, Zika, dengue fever. And we said Barbadians ought not to be dealing with this, because the other problem is we are too small. That is why we have a record of excelling in public health for almost a century, because of the implications for people on a small landmass. And I said as well, we felt that Barbados needed cleaning up. There needed to be debushing. There needed to be a cleaning of drains, because all of that, along with the garbage and the derelict houses, contributes to the health of the nation being put at risk. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish I could be in a position today to speak with clarity, because the Minister of Finance outlined today as a strategic objective that he would be seeking to protect the public health of this country. But no such luck. No such luck. And then when you come back to it and you realize that your interest costs equate to almost that which you are spending in personal emoluments. 594 million for statutory and 164 million for other personal emoluments. And we spend this $730 million in interest alone, and a government burying its head in the sand rather than calling the whole country together. It may be a bit too much to ask the Prime Minister to do, but he needs to do it. And saying this is where we are. And we have difficult decisions to make as a people. And I give you the assurance that while the burden must be shared, the bounty will also be shared. It's true that the public might not believe it, since the bounty has only gone into the hands of a few. And literally a few meaning 1, 2, 3 in the last few years. But even the public would be happy to hear that you are now taking them into your confidence and mobilizing a whole country to stabilize it, rather than giving the appearance, the political illusion of stability. You talk to any public servant and they tell you of the debts. The IMF said they conservatively estimated it at 4 to 5% of GDP, the arrears. But they also said that they couldn't rely on the data. And I say to you today, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government must do better by this country. And what is the serious discussion that we ought to be having on these matters? People can legitimately disagree as to whether they feel restructuring is an appropriate mechanism, or reprofiling, or rescheduling. There are issues because 70% of our debt is local. But the truth is that equally, a mature discussion can see whether the national insurance scheme, which needs its money in the medium to long term, can in fact begin to allow some level of interest flexibility and fiscal flexibility in the next 3-4 years to allow the government to be able to reduce its debt. Other bondholders, and that is what is meant by rescheduling. But if they can't, then you need to share with the country. Because what it means then that our situation is even more dire than we appreciate. Because what we do know is that we cannot continue to see the servicing of debt increase year upon year upon year upon year. And I say to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the government ought to treat to this discussion in a mature way. Not ignore the Minister of Agriculture and curse everybody else who says that we need to have this discussion. And for the Minister to refer to it as scaremongering. And then to come in here and say, tell the lady from RBC turn up at my desk next week with the debts and tell us which one she can reduce the rates on. The lady from RBC may not be Barbadian, but she deserves our respect. RBC deserves our respect. This is a company that has been in Barbados for over 100 years. And the comments from members on the front bench tell me that this kind of behavior is given succor by by those on the front bench. This is not how we behave. This is not how we behave. And the bottom line is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that every person that has sought to express a different opinion to this government has felt their wrath. Today, a certain teacher who is an Anglican priest received charges for misconduct, for daring to just express a view against this government. On this very day, he received charges for misconduct. He didn't attack anybody physically. He stated his view with a constitution that gives us freedom of expression, so long as he was not libeling anybody. And he didn't libel anybody because there are no lawsuits even purporting to claim that he libeled anybody. So, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, when I speak about tone, when I speak about the quality of leadership, when I speak about the behavior of the government, it is the same behavior that leads to these unfortunate actions that cause our citizens to believe that they can no longer live freely in the land of their birth. They can no longer express their views freely in the land of their birth. And Madam Deputy Speaker, what should the government ought to be discussing with us? I asked you to ask them already to tell us what was in the IMF report that would have defiled our eyes. That's the IMF report could not have been released last year. I asked you about the underestimation of the arrears. I asked you about their concerns. Are they concerned about the quality of data? I asked you about what they consider to be the risk which the Barbados economy faces. And when I come to assess this government's performance according to the objectives that they set out, the minister set out in the budget last year, which were modified from the August 2013 budget, which were modified from the revised medium-term fiscal strategy in 2011, which were modified from the medium-term fiscal strategy in 2010. A rolling target, if ever there was one. What were the risks? Because this House spoke to the risk 2 years ago coming out of the 2013 IMF report. And we had a serious and sensible discussion on it. But we're not to have it because the minister has ensured, or the governor or whoever else, that that report is not to be released to the Barbadian public. I want the minister also to tell us what is the relationship with Moody's. Is there still a relationship with Moody's to assess this economy? Or has it been brought to an end? I genuinely don't know. But I really would like to know whether that relationship with Moody's still exists. And I would like to know to what extent much of what we are doing here is window dressing for Moody's and Standard & Poor's and not for the benefit of the Barbadian population. Because this is what it appears to be in relation to the political optics. I also, Madam Deputy Speaker, want to come to the targets that the minister himself set. The minister told us today the deficit is down. Well, I just dealt with that. The deficit may, for this year, appear to be down, but it is going back up next year. And he hasn't told us with good cause why he's breaking his own rule, that there must be fiscal consolidation and a reduction in the deficit. Because the deficit will move next year up from 6.3 to a minimum of 7.8, and by his own admission, that does not include the full requirements of a number of institutions to which I will speak later. Minister said at page 24 of his budget that he wanted to achieve in his national medium-term economic objectives continued stabilization and growth. of the international reserves to an average of at least 20 weeks. Well, you know, when the minister first introduced the stabilization program in August 2013, one of the things he said was that there was a steep decline in the reserves because of an absence of confidence in the Barbadian economy. And at that time, in 2013, we still had reserves of over $1 billion. But the minister did not want to remind us in here today, and he is the one that has the daily figures, not us, that at the end of December last year, the governor of the central bank reported to us that the reserves had fallen to $926 million, less than it was when the Minister of Finance said there was need for urgent intervention. That the reserves at the end of December 2015 were less than what they were when he said that he had to inflict hardship on Barbadian people. And after 3,000 people going home, after all other kinds of taxation and measures being inflicted, and institutions starved of resources, could you believe that the reserves in Barbados at the end of December were worse than when we started? 2, I spoke to the deficit. And I just told you it's going back up next year. But for sure it is not 4.2% based on what he projected it would be last year. And it is still hovering at 6.3% with a hope that we will get the most extraordinary revenue collection in February and March that the country has ever hoped to get. And with a hope that he can continue to contain supplementaries, of which we know there's at least still 40 million to go on because of what went as supplementary number 9 and what is coming as supplementary number 10 and God knows what else. He indicated that he hoped to reduce, to reinvigorate, and bring growth back to 2.5% to 3.5% of GDP. And I read out for you just now that at the same time he was saying that, the governor of the central bank was saying it too. And both have had to come and revise that not only was the IMF closer to the target at 0.8%, but growth is in fact anemic at 0.5%. Half of 1%, so negligible as to be incapable of being seen by the naked eye, and certainly being felt by the ordinary Barbadian. But by his own measurement, we need at least 2.5% to 3.5%, which we agree with. But we are not seeing it, and have not seen it, and this government is doing nothing either to put us on a path to achieve it, either by way of the provision of resources or by the actions that are possible that don't need financial resources in order to be able to give people confidence and the space and certainty to be able to plan out their affairs, because as we all know, businesses and households is what drives growth, not governments. Governments in themselves. And then, Madam Deputy Speaker, he set a goal for a medium-term debt anchor to stabilize this country. Now, when you set a medium-term debt anchor for 2018 in 2015, you would expect that debt would start to come down 2016, 2017, 2018. But the truth is, rather than it being a medium-term debt anchor in and around Barbados, it clearly was an anchor set somewhere in the Northern Caribbean and the Moorings Pop. Because far from that, the debt in this country now is at an astronomical level of in excess of $13 billion. If you were to take into account the national insurance debt, government owes national insurance $3.2 billion. And all this talk that you can net it out, as we will come to later, and as I spoke to last night, it is a separate legal entity to which the monies owing still have to be paid. And the bottom line also is that when you look at central government debt and public sector debt, Madam Deputy Speaker, the bottom line is that gross public sector debt and the national insurance debt comes up to a figure of 155% of GDP. Now, the letter written by the Minister of Agriculture to the Prime Minister already pointed to the difficulties of that growing debt. You don't want to listen to the Barbados Labour Party as a government? Listen to your own. And this country, therefore, becomes one of the most highly indebted countries, definitely in the region, and in the Americas. But we are going on like business as usual. And I say to this Parliament that the Minister of Finance has a duty, along with the Prime Minister, to lead a mature and sensible discussion on our debt and our debt servicing, because we will not come back close to anything at all to do with growth in this country if this continues to be our position. And as if that were not bad enough, the excessive taxation and the absence of opportunities for our people have led this country, and I'm going to make this a document of the House, because the central bank does not collect these figures. But I asked my office, which fortunately has some of the best public servants Barbados ever had, still working in it, to produce them. And a gentleman, Mr. Prescott, has produced the calculation of the rates of savings in this country going back from 1975 right down to 2014. And I make it a document of the House because I believe that all members should see it. And for the very first time since 1975, Madam Deputy Speaker, this country is going through a period of dissavings. And at the rate of dissavings in 2014 was minus 0.1. That even when we had our difficulties between 75 and 77, we went down in 76 to single-digit savings rates. 91 to 94, we were able to hold savings because that was predominantly a foreign exchange problem. And since 2010, our savings rate dropped in half between 2010 and 11, from 16.3 to 8.3%. And by 2014, this table tells us what we already know, that Barbadians have had to pull in to their savings in order to survive, whether Barbadian families, individuals, or Barbadian companies. And when you look at the situation, Madam Deputy Speaker, look at the figures in relation to the accounts, the commercial banks in terms of the savings. Demand savings in Barbados has fallen in 2007 from 3.3 billion to 2.8 billion at the end of 2014. Madam Deputy Speaker, time deposits in this country in 2007 was at the level of 2.3 billion. It is now down to 1.3 billion at the end of 2014. We don't need these numbers to tell us what Badians feel every day. People have had to dig into the pockets. People are reeling, trying to keep up with their mortgages or the rent. And the bottom line is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this government continues to ignore the fact that if you really want growth in this economy, you have to ease the pressure off of households and businesses in order for them to have the ability to spend. And then the second part of the equation is that they must have confidence in the government to spend, to believe that a government is not going to come like a thief in the night and take money out of their pockets again, to believe that when a government says that these projects are going to start and continue, that it will start and continue and don't become a case of hope and optimism and long promises. Barbadians are distressed by the quality of their governance. And when combined with the absence of savings, We are at the worst point we could ever be in the 50th anniversary of our nation's history as a country, as an independent state. And believe you me, and believe you me, Madam Deputy Speaker, we take no delight in this, because year after year after year after year, we have come into this chamber and asked this government to ease the burden off of people. And what happens instead? More pressure. And then when we look at it, why is it that we're not earning? Why is it that our productive sectors are not performing as they should? And you know, sir, when I hear that tourism numbers are up, I'm glad to hear that. But tourism numbers being up caused me to believe that tourism revenue should be up too. If tourism numbers went up by 13%, and they are finally back at what they were in 2007, wouldn't you expect that tourism revenue be up too? Pass it by 20,000. But I want to, let us all clap for the Minister of Tourism who took 8 years to get beyond the 2007 numbers. Let's give him that. But when we give him that, can we ask him when he gets up to speak later today, why is it that revenue from tourism, because numbers coming don't mean anything in a vacuum. We're not here to count numbers of people. We're here to see what the impact of tourists has on this economy. How does it provide jobs to Barbadians? How does it provide revenue to people selling services and goods to tourists? How does the government benefit from the foreign exchange inflows, either through investment or through spend? That is what tourism means to us. Not arbitrary metrics and indices like the Minister of Finance comes in here today to throw at people. We can throw all the indices out the window. When said and done, what does it mean to the average Bajan? You believe that tourism in 2007 was earning $2.4 billion almost, 2.38 billion to be precise. And at the end of 2015, we're still struggling to earn $1.95 billion, almost $400 million less. At a time when the minister says we're getting more numbers. And you're earning almost $400 million less. And what is worse is that prices have gone up by almost 50%. So if the earning of tourism in 2007 was to be equated to the earning of tourism in 2015, then we should be earning at least $3.2 billion from tourism. And what are we earning? Struggling to make $2 billion. Struggling to make $2 billion. And what is the reality? That all of the talk about sandals, we're glad for sandals because we believe it helped the government with airlift. But it doesn't help the people with procurement. There's no level playing field still on the mechanisms. Some hotels have gotten some things, others have not. But we didn't ask Sandals to pass the same criteria that you give the Bajan hotels. So when you tell them, oh, you're not compliant with ABC, Sandals wasn't asked that. Sandals got the tax benefits in 2-3 days. And the ones now that can't get because they're in a debt trap have no hope of ever being competitive, which puts them in a more vicious cycle. And that is the state of tourism in this country. And as a mature product, we all know that there is need for further investment in the quality of our product if our rooms are to be competitive as against other rooms in the region. Now, I say this with no sense of any glee. The minister came with a 10-point plan in July 2013. Plans for retrofitting on energy and all kinds of things and upgrades to St. Lawrence Gap and this and that and that. The minister hasn't reported to us the progress on it. 30 hotels out of how many? And loss of rooms overall. The Minister of Finance tells us and laid out for us in his budget a series of hotels to be done. That will start. And the only one we know of that has started is the Sandy Beach, and I believe ground has now broken at Beachlands. Settlers Beach hasn't started. They keep going, because it's not me alone here in these projects. It is the Barbadian public, just like how the minister told us in 2013 that he would give 50 million US to the BTMI from an IDB policy loan. The Minister of Tourism never saw that, because it never came. But the BTMI still owes too many people across the globe. And that's the reality of our tourism project. And in these estimates, still not giving BTMI what it needs, voting 85 million, but ask the Minister of Tourism how much BTMI got. They didn't get 85 million. So this is a farce. We thought we were giving them that. And the bottom line is, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not just about numbers of tourists. It's about earning, and it's about jobs. And the bottom line also is that there are some serious issues still attending to our tourism sector in terms of profitability. And until we address it, the level and quality of investment is simply not going to be there. That is why this government is having to vote $80 million for Sam Lords in here. If it was so grand an opportunity, the private sector would be doing it. But there are serious issues attending to the profitability of our tourism sector. Now that also requires a mature discussion, because there may be decisions that we have to make as a people and as a country that hitherto we did not think of or did not want to go there. But the notion that anything that is said that is at variance with this government must now become the subject of a cussing, must now become the subject of allegations of scaremongering, must now become the subject of charges being proffered, or people having to go to the police station to give statements as we had to do, the member for St. James Central, the member for St. Joseph, and myself. These things are wrong. And when I talk about tone, that is what I'm referring to. What is the reality in terms of the international business sector? The revenue of the international business sector is down by almost $2 million.
I remember, sorry for breaking a strike, please. Yes, I remember.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, international business revenue from licenses of international business companies is down $2 million. What is the reality in relation to manufacturing in this country? These are not my figures, sir. These are figures from the Barbados Economic and Social Report for 2014, because we do not yet have the 2015 one in our possession. And this is one of the things that I have come to really regret, that when we have this debate in estimates, this data ought to be in our possession. You are asking us to make and to debate on aged data. And as I said, that tone and what this democracy now stands for bothers me. But what is the reality on the 2014 data? That manufacturing in Barbados is down 18% in the last 7 years. Manufacturing is down 18%. Exports are down by $50 million. from 595 million to 548. And sugar production is now down to 7,000 tons, we are being told this year, down from 35,000 tons in 2007. Almost every sector that we have traditionally relied upon to be able to bring us out is tottering. And it's tottering not only because of sectoral reasons. In my view, it is tottering because of a stubbornness on the part of the government to recognize that it may not be able to do better until it fixes itself and restructures itself first as a government, and second in relation to its fiscal stability. And when you have all of this happening at the same time, Madam Deputy Speaker, and there's an article that I will make a document of the House on the Canadian banking system in the region, that all members would do well to read. Published on the 28th of February 2016 in the Globe and Mail, reflecting a fact that we've been talking about informally for a year. That it is clear that there is a contraction of the presence of the three major Canadian banks in the region, and that that contraction has led to the difficulty that the one thing that you need to trigger growth is access to capital. It's like oxygen. And I heard the member for Christchurch, West Central, in a debate in this House last week, speak at length about the need for development bank financing, development financing for small and medium-sized businesses in this country. Yes, he did. Because I found it curious that this government continues to talk about ideas while forgetting that they are the executive. If you have a problem and you recognize that Barbadian businesses cannot access funding easily, what are you doing about it? Because the bottom line is, Mr. Speaker, that the clear contraction of the Canadian banks is not a problem peculiar to Barbados. It's across the region. But because of our circumstances, the implications will be far worse for us than they would be for anybody else who was not in this position. And what are the facts? The facts, Mr. Speaker, are that First Caribbean, Scotiabank, and Royal Bank of Canada have been experiencing an increase in gross impaired loans across the region that is way beyond that which the region is responsible for revenue to them as a global entity in each respective case. And therefore, you begin to understand why there is a reluctance and why they feel reluctant to be able to lend money in key areas that are necessary for us for our growth. But while we accept that as their position, and while we see the evidence, because First Caribbean, for example, has 69 branches across the region in 17 Caribbean countries. The revenue that they get from the entire Caribbean is about $593 million of their overall $13.4 billion. So the Caribbean is responsible for only about 4.4% of First Caribbean's revenue as an entity. But of the gross impaired loans, 58.4% of First Caribbean's impaired loans come from the Caribbean. Responsible for 4% of revenue, but responsible for 58% of the impaired loans. Untenable. Scotiabank, same thing. Region is responsible for 5% of its revenue, namely $1.2 billion out of $23.6 billion. But the impaired loans coming from the Caribbean are 35.2% of Scotiabank's impaired loans. Royal Bank of Canada, the revenue coming from Royal Bank from the region, 861 million, responsible for only 2.5% of the total 34 billion of Royal Bank's revenue. But the region is responsible for 40% of Royal Bank's impaired loans. Now, if I were a Minister of Finance, I would have to take a serious look at these figures. I would have to work out in my head, how can I ensure that enterprises and households in my country can have access to capital, clearly seeing what signs are on the horizon. We have no national commercial bank anymore. We have enterprise growth fund and micro fund access, for micro loans. And we have to begin to ask ourselves, how are we going to ensure that our people who need access to capital to help us grow this economy get it? And it is that kind of mature debate that I would have expected that these estimates would have contemplated, rather than the cuss-fest, the bombast and the bluster that we were entertained with in here today. And what is the other reality confronting the banking sector? That indigenous banks in the Caribbean have been losing correspondent banking relationships with banks on the outside world, thereby threatening their ability to provide services to their clients once those services are dependent on trade finance or remittance or anything to do with the outside world. And the World Bank report published in November of last year showed that the Caribbean is the region most affected by the withdrawal of correspondent banking relationships. Now, what is the reality of the problem? That while there may be legitimate cause in some instances, in many instances, our small size has caused major banks internationally to say that we are not prepared to incur the costs to be able to do the risk assessment to maintain relationships with Caribbean banks. And in those circumstances, it is better to shut it down than to undergo that risk assessment on an annual basis to maintain these correspondent banking relationships. Now, this is going to require advocacy. I see that the CARICOM heads of government have set up a subcommittee of heads to deal with it, led by the Prime Minister of Antigua. But the truth is that this issue is so important for the Caribbean region, because it will impact on what access to banking services our clients, our constituents can have in relation to banks operating that are indigenous within our region, but dependent on international banking relationships because of trade of services, trade in goods, or remittances. And these are the things that I expected this Parliament to discuss, because they will come to impact on the quality of our growth and the rate of our growth. And the rate and quality of our growth is absolutely critical if Barbadians are to stop suffering. And I don't know how we can believe that it is therefore okay to come in here. The member is so consumed about the welfare of the opposition, I can assure him, we can take care of ourselves. Don't need nothing from you. But what we understand is that our duty once we come in here is to defend the people and not to be consumed with party politics or electoral politics or elections. And the $5 million for independence, if the government was genuinely serious about a national celebration for independence, the Barbados Labour Party has been the government for 24 of the 50 years. I came in good faith to the ceremony on January 6th in town, in spite of the fact that the Barbados Labour Party was not invited to serve on. I heard the Prime Minister in November in this chamber get up and say, we are consulting with the Chamber of Commerce, we're consulting with the churches, we're consulting with every conceivable group. And the one group he didn't mention, and the one group they have not consulted with is the Barbados Labour Party that constituted a government for 24 of the 50 years in this country. And then you want us to believe that it is a genuine national celebration. $7 million. Now we all want to celebrate 50 years of nationhood. But when you are suffering and people can't find housing, or people can't pay the rent or mortgages, or can't buy food, can't we not find a more appropriate way to engage in celebrations that is sympathetic to the condition of our people? I walked through town the night when the fireworks were going off, and from group to group to group to group, people were saying, look at we taxpayers' money going up in the air. Look at it going up in smoke. Now, I accept that there are times when a state will have to do things. I'm not going to complain about certain expenditures at the central bank, because the central bank has a role to play. But I do believe that if you are asking Barbadians to share a burden as we go through these difficult times, then it must appear as though everybody is sharing that burden. Everybody. And when stories therefore emerge that the National Insurance Board, led by the Minister of Labour, could want the Cabinet to agree to increase the fees of the directors of the National Insurance Board from $300 to $900 a month, a 200% increase in board fees, in circumstances where other Barbadians are having to literally scotch to be able to eat food, then I say this is the wrong message that we are sending our population. And this is the same minister who last week told the NUPW, oh, I judge you have no case for back pay. But then at the same time, she and her ministry...
Ready one, don't want
Yes, I remember.
Point of order. You all remember, Mr. Speaker, sir, is, I believe, misleading the House. I'm a member of the Cabinet of Barbados as Minister of Finance, and I do not know of, or can I recall, any cabinet paper that has come to, cabinet paper or otherwise, asking the Cabinet to agree to increase the fees of directors of the National Insurance from $300 to $900 or $800. And therefore, I think that if the member has evidence to that effect, that she should make the said paper a document of the House, or have that matter withdrawn, because it clearly is not true. I'm saying it is not true.
Said that they had reached cabinet. Yeah, I said that is intending to come to cabinet.
Very well.
I said that the Minister of Labour is intending to bring to cabinet. And Mr. Speaker, let the Minister of Finance deny that the National Insurance Board and the Minister have been dealing with this matter. Let him deny it, because it is a fact. And the bottom line is that we will bring the evidence in here for that too.
Order, Mr.
Yes,
Speaker,
I remember.
sir, I can categorically deny that I have any knowledge of or information pertaining to any such matter between the Minister of Labour, the Honourable Minister of Labour, and the National Insurance, whether board or directorate.
The member has answered in the same way that he did with the deficit.
Let me go on. Our members, you see, in the absence of any information, any documentary evidence, either way, I'm unable to uphold the point of order. But in fairness to the House, they would expect that the evidence is produced in the fullness of time.
And I'm saying that the Minister of Finance has denied in the same way that he has denied with the evidence on the deficit. I never asked whether he had knowledge. I said, let him deny that the National Insurance Board and the Minister of Labour are working on this. And that's the point. So that all the the spirited denial relates to an allegation that was not made on him. But that is, Mr. Speaker, the manner in which this government conducts its affairs. And since he wants me to deal with the national insurance, let me deal with it now. Let me deal with it. Because a legitimate issue was placed. He could find every aspect to refer to it this morning in his speech, but still did not speak to the circumstances which are of legitimate concern to every Barbadian who is expecting to get a pension from the National Insurance Scheme and who is interested in what and how the National Insurance Scheme is being treated to by this government. I maintain that the National Insurance Scheme is owed $240 million, there or thereabouts, by this government. And to the last extent we made this allegation 2 years ago, instead of the government of Barbados, the Ministry of Finance, paying it cash for the debt, and this debt relates to contributions, to reimbursement for non-contributory pensions, and for the rental of the various government buildings, Baobab and other government buildings, which the government of Barbados rents from the National Insurance Scheme. Instead of the government paying it cash when it owed it the money 2 years ago, it made the NIS take government paper, ignoring the fact that the NIS needs liquidity in many instances and cannot only be holding paper and debt instruments. Well, the government has allowed the debt to the NIS separate from the government paper to go back up to $240 million. No rental being paid on a regular basis for the buildings that it occupies. Not paying for the statutory corporations or itself, in many instances, the NIS, and not paying the reimbursement for the non-contributory pensions, which is really a debt of the Ministry of Finance, but the sums are paid by the NIS because of the ease with which the NIS can pay. No, we accept that things rough. We accept that. But what this government ought not to have done is to continue to treat the governance as if it is something that a government of Barbados can ignore with wild and reckless abandon. And what do I mean by this? In January 2014, Mr. Speaker, the National Insurance Scheme was directed by the Minister of Finance, who can direct it under the powers of Section 30, subsection 5 of the Act, which he possesses to direct the NIS on investments. The Minister of Finance directed it to lend the Barbados Tourism Investment Inc. $55 million to purchase Amman Beach from Massey, Neil Massey as it used to be, towards the purchase of Amman Beach Village, Speightstown. That loan was to have been for 2 years. And that loan agreement had in it a clause that BTII should not seek to sell the property without the consent of the National Insurance Board. The mistake the National Insurance Board made was not to put a mortgage in place and to have that mortgage registered, as they would have done with any other third-party borrower borrowing its funds. You go to the bank lends you money, the bank asks you for security, they don't only rely on the loan agreement, they put a mortgage in place if it is real property. And that mortgage is registered at the land registry. The 2 years, the loan was to have been repaid on the 31st of January 2016. On the 27th of January 2016, a letter came from BTII to the NIS saying that that loan which we are to repay you in 4 days' time on the 31st of January, be advised that as directed by the Minister of Finance, we are now requesting that we don't have to pay you back that money now, but we will pay you back that money in 18 months' time. Now, they went further to say that it was not just the Minister of Finance directing this, but there was a cabinet decision. A cabinet decision made on the 28th of May 2015 that asked the cabinet to rescind the decision of July 21st, 2014, that the proceeds from the sale of the Ammons Beach Village at Haywoods would go to repay the National Insurance Board for the $55 million that it borrowed from the National Insurance Board. So the cabinet in July 24th, I don't know what they were doing in it for the first place, because the cabinet is not the National Insurance Board. The National Insurance Board is a separate statutory entity with clear objectives to protect the workers' money. The cabinet has no locus standi, no lawful authority to direct the National Insurance Board or anything. So the decision in July 2014 was as wrong as the decision in May 2015. The Minister of Finance, pursuant to Section 30, subsection 5 of that Act, is who can give the instruction. So that when on 4 days before the loan is due, you go to the National Insurance Board and say, the money you may have been relying on to do A, B, C, D, E will not now be paid. But worse than that, the property was sold. And the property was sold since months ago. And when the property was sold, the money that we were to repay you, or step back, the fact that we were to ask you for permission to sell the property, we didn't do that. And the money that we were to repay you from the proceeds of the sale, we're not doing that either. And we are telling you that we're not doing it because the cabinet tell us we could break the loan agreement and don't do it. Because the cabinet is clearly inciting BTII to break a loan agreement to which the cabinet is not party. Now this is what gets this country in trouble. And this government's failure to obey the law, selling diesel at the transport board when it had no authority to do so, taking $30 million from a housing credit fund to pay a contractor and a bank for the grotto when the Solicitor General has told them that they have no lawful authority to extract that $30 million for a housing development, which, by the way, is only occupied by Bush and not people since it finished 20 months ago. And then you come again and break the law. And I talked about Cahill before. And I'm saying to you that it is this breach of governance that continues to reel us from confusion to confusion. But yet you want to get the police go into Swan Street and you take a vendor up and put them before the law courts for selling without a license. And the people from Clico and this government can break law after law after law and not feel that they must be accountable for it. I say it is wrong. The Minister of Finance hurriedly put a letter of comfort in place after there was clear evidence that the National Insurance Board wanted their money. The BTII is saying we want it rolled over for 18 months. The NIS is saying, no, we need our money. And what comes from the Minister of Finance in February, dated the 1st of February, after the date of the loan, is a letter of comfort that expires on the 31st of March for 2 months. And in the meantime, BTIA and Cabinet saying, hold on to the Sam Lords Castle property. But who tell you the NIS want to hold on to the mortgage to Sam Lords? And further than that, has Sam Lord's property issues been resolved? Have you cleared the first mortgage on Sam Lord's owned by another hotelier that came out of the law courts? Have you cleared the second mortgage at Sam Lord's owned by Republic Bank? But you don't want to put the national insurance in that Pele case, in that confusion, when all the National Insurance Board wants is its $55 million. And we know that the BTII has sold the property to Sanders or a related entity of the Sanders Group. Where has the $55 million been diverted to use? What has it been diverted to be used for? And why could it not go back to the NIS and allow BTII to float another bond for the purposes for which it really wants it, rather than diverting the money? Diverting the money. Under the loan agreement, that would immediately become due upon the sale of a property. Now, I can only say that the Minister of Labour ought to be standing up for the National Insurance Scheme, because she is duty-bound to protect the social security of this country as the minister for it. If she is a pawn, then she must go. And if she was not a pawn, then she must speak out to the country about what action she took to preclude this directive from Cabinet superseding a loan agreement to which Cabinet was not a party. It is wrong, it is wrong, it is wrong. And it is this callous and reckless approach to governance that causes Barbadians to feel that this government needs to go. And we need to see the back of it, because we cannot carry the weight of the suffering that it is imposing on the people of this country much longer. We cannot carry the incompetence. We cannot carry the uncaring attitude. We cannot carry the breaches of the law. And we cannot carry the elements of corruption within it. And I say to you, Mr. Speaker, that it is unethical. It is unethical. And it is poor governance. And you know, sir, the Minister of Finance could just as easily have written and negotiated with one of the commercial banks for a letter of comfort such that the NIS would have been repaid its money. I am not the one who says we don't default, you know. And I want to believe him when he says it. But I just see that they just don't pay. They just don't pay. And the loan agreement is very, very clear. And I'm saying to you that this is not how we do business in this country. And the government cannot believe that it can sit in Bay Street and put itself in a place of separate legal entities. This is why the 94 Democratic Labour Party administration imploded. The belief that you could supplant one legal entity for another as if they were one and the same person, one and the same entity. And it is as if they have not learned anything from their earlier experiences. It was why the Public Accounts Committee had cause to comment negatively on St. Joseph Hospital, that you treated a board and removed from the board the powers to hire, and a minister assumed them. Have we not learned in this country? Have we not learned? And what is worse still, sir, all of this happens against the background of these other operations in relation to the National Insurance Board. There are people who are deeply concerned, sir, and this government must remember that it is only responsible for the executive for a limited period of time, and it is holding it in trust. There's a fiduciary duty, and that they have a responsibility that goes beyond their term in office to treat to an institution that tens of thousands of Barbadians will depend on. And you know, I well recall, because unlike all people, I do accept that there are times when the Minister of Finance will have to direct the National Insurance Board. It happened in Four Seasons. Yes. And they had to be satisfied. The issue came up as to whether they had to be directed or not. And they had to be satisfied that there was a commercial rate of return from the project. And what happened then, and the full details will come up when he's ready for it too. Full. Was that there were issues and concerns about whether the investment was one that they should invest in or not. And I got as much fires as him. But the bottom line is that they have a duty to be told why it is that after 2 years, neither them nor the public of Barbados can be brought up to date as to what is happening. And this is not an issue that I will run from because I was a lawyer. Believe you me. And I have thousands and thousands of documents on this matter. But my point is, Mr. Speaker, that there is a genuine concern about how this government has treated the National Insurance Scheme. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, that the National Insurance Scheme has been prevented from investing overseas under this government since 2008? True. Do you know that? True. And that this government has forced, the Minister of Education is looking with a blank look on his face. His colleagues should tell him. And the question is, as they tell him that, advise us, because I genuinely don't know whether the Central Bank Pension Fund is allowed to invest overseas. Because I don't know how there can be one law. I really don't know. I don't know how you can refuse to allow the National Insurance Scheme from making any investments outside of Barbados. True. At a time when we know that over-concentration in one market may lead to significant risk to the fund that are not wise. God forbid something happen like a hurricane and a lot of Barbados is affected. Then it means that a lot of the NIS's investment portfolio stands to be affected too. And I ask this government in all conscience to please review the very unwise decision that the Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance have presided over, preventing the NIS from investing outside of Barbados for the last 8 years. I am not one of those who believe that the level of investment has to be astronomical, because I do accept that people's pension funds and working funds, the workers' money, must also be used to help build out this country. But there must be a balance. Too far east is always west. And when you have it overly exposed to the domestic market, with no ability to be able to participate in the foreign market, then we are playing with danger. And there are other concerns. We need a sensible discussion in this country and in these estimates. The Minister of Finance could have said to us this morning, instead of the bluster and bombast, that we have a problem that has been triggered as a result of our anemic economic performance. And because of the level of layoffs and the reduction in the volume of contributions to NIS, a situation that we did not contemplate to reach until 2018 has been thrust upon us as early as April 2013. There are members on the other side who are hearing these things for the first time. So that for the first time, they're hearing them. We were not to reach a situation where contribution income was dwarfed, was exceeded by benefit expenditure until 2018. But in April 2013, we were spending more money on benefits than we were getting from income from contributions of people to the NIS scheme. A good full 5 years before it was contemplated. This is what this Parliament must be speaking about in the 50th anniversary of independence. Not talking the nonsense that we're talking about in here with the bombast that we hear it. And then the leader of government business not knowing how to behave on the adjournment. But Barbadians see it for themselves. Barbadians see it for themselves. Barbadians see it for themselves. And the bottom line is, Madam, Mr. Speaker, sir, what's the acid test of these estimates? What's the acid test? The hospital, not me, sir. Ministers of Health and Ministers of Finance 2 years ago in this honorable chamber said the hospital needed 185 million to function every year. And this is exclusive of the capital. 185 million. It wasn't us, but the junior doctors. The other doctors, the nurses, the patients, complaining about lack of supplies. The Minister of Health has a duty to tell us how much is still owing after the meeting of November 2014 at the Lara Court, when the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health promised to clear $25 million in debt to the drug companies, the pharmaceutical companies. That's what we need to be hearing in here. Don't just tell us about the $9 million system as if all the hospital needs is $146 million. The Minister of Finance and the Minister of Health are both privy to briefs that have said that they need $185 million. And this is a matter of deep concern. I saw the Minister of Finance as I went in the hospital. I was coming out of the hospital, he was going in. And it is not something that gives me pleasure. In fact, I hadn't been in for a few months. And I really feel that something even as basic as the ceiling tiles, I'm going to speak to my colleagues and hope that the Minister of Health will accept a donation from the Barbados Labour Party to put the ceiling tiles in at the hospital. I really do. Mr. Speaker, this government can continue to play the politics, but let me tell you what the ceiling tiles does. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what the absence of ceiling tiles does. Look up there and see how much dust. They think it's a joke, you know. They think it's a joke until one of their family end up in the hospital, but then again, they might send them overseas. You walk through the hospital, go this evening, and you see the dust, you see the rust. Are you going to ask the Shadow Minister of Health to take the pictures since you don't believe? The Minister of Health says, throw it in. Don't believe it. But when you get respiratory problems and other difficulties because of the manner in which, I would be interested to hear the perspective of a doctor. I really would. But common sense would tell me that anywhere that stores dust and rust and those kinds of things in an environment that should be sterile can't be good for you. I would be interested to hear, and the Minister of Finance, if he was being sincere with this country, would tell us where the absence of the $40 million that is needed. Because what he hasn't told you is that wages alone at the hospital is $110 million. What he hasn't told you is that they have been refusing to fill vacancies, which has put inordinate stress on doctors and nurses and orderlies and everybody. What he hasn't told you is what is the statement of arrears. These arrears are not the member for Christchurch Southorn. They're not the member for St. Michael Northwest. These people are here only because the public says they can be here for 5 years. They're not dealing with matters home at them. And no opposition party, nor no country, nor no population should have to be begging for information as to what a government needs. We accept that things are difficult. But let us share in the decision making as to where resources are to go in this country. And when I ask, therefore, for this information, I'm not asking because I feel like wasting breath. I have other things I could go and do too. Let's look at the National Housing Corporation. This is not my information, theirs. Their budget, they need $43.8 million to run when the year comes. Sorry, $44.9 million. If you feel it's weekend work, you lie. And Mr. Speaker, this National Housing Corporation is receiving not even $10 million now, but from rentals. Not even $10 million from rentals. It's commercial sales. If you're lucky, because it depends on whether people have money to buy. They want to hope to get about 20 billion. But guess what? In these estimates, a subvention only of $5 million. And they're spending $45 million a year. But we already know that the Ministry of Finance has had to commit to pay the 2 loans for the National Housing Corporation. And we know that the bill of $1.1 million, which we have learned about in the other place, is now 1.1 down from what it was before the layoffs. That without the Ministry of Finance paying that, staff can't get paid at the NHC. That's why you had the embarrassing situation before Christmas with the NHC staff not being able to be paid, and again in January. But the government is going to come in here and play politics like if it's a board game. A board game. A board game. And all the talk, Minister of Finance didn't mention NHC this morning about the top-ups. He said UE, Transport Board, and QEH. Well, I assume that you will have to do for NHC too. And all I'm saying is this, that this is not matters in which we take delight. But if you are projecting a deficit of 7.8%, if you are projecting a deficit of $723 million net of amortization, by the time you add 20 more million or 25 for national housing, 40 for the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, the university is short somewhere between 40 and 50 million, depending on what the economic cost is now that they have imposed these fees. Transport Board, according to their subs, seems to be short an average 20 million at least, because you voted 21 million in subs last year, and you vote 21 million again. When I add those figures up, you are talking close to $150 million more in expenditure, which is another 2% of GDP. And it is easy not to vote it. It is easy not to bring the supplementary. But it does not change the liability of the statutory board to the client class. It does not change the provision of goods and services that it is duty-bound to provide. And you know, the most telling point came from the governor of the central bank last week in Brooklyn. When dismissing the issue of debt restructuring, he didn't dismiss it totally out of order, you know. And the Minister of Agriculture should read the article. He said, it makes no sense to do debt restructuring if you do not fundamentally restructure the things leading to the deficit. I know why he's getting upset every time you hear the governor name. I can appreciate that. I appreciate that. But the governor said it makes no sense to do debt restructuring if the underlying restructuring is not being done, such that you still end up with a chronic deficit problem. And the government, not my words, I don't know if it was because he was in Brooklyn, the government has not made sufficient progress on the restructuring of the government to bring down the fiscal deficit. That's what the governor said in Brooklyn. Read Barbados Today last week. So here is the governor now for the first time contemplating that it is possible, but that it needs the precondition of the government delivering on the restructuring to bring down the deficit in a fulsome way. So, Mr. Speaker, when I say to you that this deficit going back up next year is of concern, it's not because I'm concerned about numbers. As I just said about the hospital, it is about the terms and conditions. In the case of the Transport Board, the member for St. George South spoke of the unfortunate incident of a constituent of his. No bus route to her. Had to pay taxi money to go to the polyclinic. This is a pensioner, you know. Get to the polyclinic only to be told, we can't deal with you today. I had to take a taxi back home. $80 out of her pocket, out of pension check, and still has not achieved what she went to achieve. And that is because the Transport Board is not in a position to adequately service the routes across the country. There are people who are getting to work hour and a half, 2 hours late. Most employers who are sympathetic understand. But there are some employers who tell them, don't come in. You get here late, you lose the day's pay. These are real issues. And I've said over and over in here, this is not a Democratic Labour Party problem. No, they may have caused it, but it's a Barbados problem. And therefore, we have a duty as a country all to step up to the plate to resolve it. When you see what is beginning to happen, and I won't go into the crime issues in this debate because I'm told we're doing AG and Home Affairs in the estimate, so I won't touch on it long. Agriculture, Public Works. But when you see last year as what's happening across St. Michael, the wanton crime, and in St. Lucie and other areas too, that was taking place. Pictures of youngsters on Facebook with all kinds of weaponry in the hand. And I ask myself, does this government see the reality of what is going on in Barbados? Does it make sense to build out 4 police stations at $76 million now that cannot be ready for 2 years? Or should we satisfy ourselves with 2 police stations, give the police the vehicles that they need to police Barbados within the next month, create at least and buy at least 4 to 5 mobile police units that can be placed in hot spots across Barbados, as was done with Chapman Lane. And it worked. It worked. The member for the city of Bridgetown will speak to you about it. That did work. Because once you have that presence, it makes a difference. Now, that's not the only thing that's needed. And we need to deal with the reasons why we have a situation with the guns and these youngsters. 20, 30 years ago, a fella doing nonsense hit you with a 2x3. You could survive. When you shoot now, the chances of survival are much less. And I'm saying to you, we were the ones, you know why I'm speaking in this way, sir? You know the original cabinet paper for them police stations I approved in February 2006? That's how long this government been trying, and the previous government been trying to do police stations. And those 4 police stations were supposed to be ready. I approved, go and get the file. And then the member for St. Joseph dealt with it too. He only had 18 months then. Because I approved it 3 weeks before I was moved as Attorney General. And this government took 8 years. And I'm saying, fine, if we could do without the 4 stations in 8 years, put two on hold for another year and buy the mobile units because you know the government don't have any money. Buy the mobile units, buy the additional vehicles, and treat to our crime problem. And when we're doing that, take the almost $3 million, 2-point-something million dollars in here for biometrics, for the immigration department, the public service announcement that you're going to start to break new ground in the world and be the first country to fingerprint its own citizens leaving and entering a country. Absolute nonsense and madness. And money in these estimates, I asked the Minister of Finance, move the money for the fingerprinting in here and give it to the country, the Environmental Protection Department, to knock down some derelict houses, please. Give it to the Environmental Protection Department to knock down some houses. Because when you go to start the fingerprinting the derelict houses, don't play that you don't know that they got derelict houses causing nuisances, public health nuisances to people in this country. And I am saying to you, Mr. Speaker, that money for fingerprinting of Barbadians at the airport and the seaport will not see the light of day. It is wrong, not to mention that the regulations were made in the wrong way, but I will leave that to the law courts to do. And I thank the member for St. James North and the senator for the other place with joining with other public interested lawyers, namely Mr. Comijong, to test it, because the regulations were made wrong. You don't gazette regulations before laying them in Parliament. In order for the regulations to be effected, the regulations have to be subject to negative resolution for 40 days. It is too basic a point. The member for St. James Central is trying his best to talk across to them, but they're not going to understand it, Star. Don't bother your head. So, no from now, the Minister of Finance said that he is not casting concrete this morning, that when it is clear that money cannot be spent, do the decent thing and tell you that the money can be spent and let you reallocate it. Well, I'm helping you. Reallocate that money for the biometrics because you can't spend it, because the regulations not only are made wrong, is the best part. The regulations are made under a section of the Immigration Act that is designed to allow the minister to make regulations for people who are on suspicion of entering. But how a Bajan could be on suspicion of entering inappropriately to their own country? So however which way you look at it, the regulations are made wrong, and this has... Mr. Speaker, this has nothing to do with the fundamental reasoning behind it. And let's get real. Even if the government wanted to do something, you cannot take fingerprints from April 1. Against which database would you be assessing these fingerprints? There's no database to assess these fingerprints against. This is in the estimates, over $2 million to spend. And then secondly, what are you going to do when a Barbadian citizen says, I'm not giving you my fingerprints? Where are you going to deport them to? You can't deport your own citizens. So if you can't deport them, you then criminalize your citizens. So let's start making criminals of all good people who are frightened about the breach of privacy of their fingerprints. And then the police can take them up and use it, because the police and the immigration are as separate as NIS and the cabinet. Please. You notice I've only spoken on this once, because a folly is a folly is a folly. And the law court's going to have to deal with this if good sense does not prevail. And I pray that the law courts will not have to deal with it, because then you're going to pay legal costs. There's no sense in having to pay legal costs on this issue. Let the Minister of Finance be given this money. The Minister of Health is in charge of Environmental Protection Health. If he is in charge, let him get the money to remove some of these derelict houses about here, the $2 million. We will support the change in the estimates because too many of our people are falling ill from vector-related diseases. We're not asking you to reduce the deficit or take it away. Shift it to the Ministry of Health, Environmental Protection Department. And the Minister of Finance knows that he got enough derelict houses down by him too. I got in me, Minister, member for St. Michael North, all across St. Michael, member for St. Michael South Central. And the problem with derelict houses in urban areas is that it's too easy to constitute a threat to public health and crime because the rats and the mosquitoes ain't got far to move. It's the Ministry of Health's information that taught me that if you have a mosquito in your house, it means there's a breeding place within 100 meters. So that the problem is more acute in urban Barbados than it is in rural Barbados. Rural Barbados has issues too, but it is more acute in urban Barbados, where you have derelict houses and cups and all kinds of thrown away instruments collecting water, stagnant water, and breaking into mosquitoes. You must forgive me for my passion because I know what the pain is of chikungunya. And I still suffer anytime I am tired. My shoulder, my knees, my feet still suffer from it because it lives with you for a while. And there are others in here who have had it too. That is the national housing, that is the hospital. The transport board, same thing I've spoken to. Look, for heaven's sake, I have no, the one thing I'm glad for is that I really am not an insecure person. Because if I was, I would not be standing here or in politics. I say to this government yet again, with all of the sincerity I can muster, we have a fight electorally whenever an election comes. That's true. And I have every confidence that I have the better team with the better policies and that the country will go with it. I really do. But in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, in the meantime, Barbados is descending at too rapid a rate. I understand why the Minister of Finance has had to come in here and make it look rosy. But let us get real. You cannot tell me that things are rosy and Barbadians can't get access to the services to which I just referred. You cannot tell me that things are rosy and you cut $1 million in this year that is closing out off the welfare budget. Look at it. The welfare budget was $15.5 million. We voted last year, and we come back to the end of the year and see a budget revised downwards to $14 million. And then I see a gentleman up to Friday on crutches, Thursday night, foot run over by a PSV, gone to welfare for assistance, can't get it. The situation with the young lady who approached myself and the Prime Minister, the member for St. Thomas, I think we spoke even to the Minister of Social Care. There are just too many deserving cases. And week by week by week, we are seeing them. And I'm saying to you, if things are so rosy, why are the people of Barbados not feeling some of the warmth? Or is it being diverted in a way that nobody wants to talk about? It can't be both. It can't be both. And I therefore say to you that we want to play our part in part of a national discussion. That's what the 50th anniversary celebration should be about, not the expenditure of $7 million in frivolous things. A calendar from the Democratic Labour Party for the... That's how I know what the celebrations are for the year. It hasn't come from the GIS, Government Information Service printery. A calendar. But if it has nothing to do with it, can I be put in a position to advise the members on my side what is involved in the 50th anniversary celebrations? There is no member in this side who knows what is involved or how this $7 million will be spent between last November and this November. And I'm saying to you that if you ask me to participate, let us participate in getting a few things right. One, let us have a mature discussion on what are our options, given the fact that our interest in debt service alone is almost at the level of our statutory and other personal emoluments, our wages in the entire public service. We should not go into the next year without knowing how Barbados as a country and as a people will deal with this issue of debt that is now sucking the air out of everything in this country and causing us to be distinguished not for the best cricketers in the world, but for the highest debt in the Americas. You could imagine that Jamaica has a lower debt to GDP ratio than Barbados. You could imagine that Dominica, Jamaica, Belize, all of them, St. Kitts, intervene. Don't tell me, come on. Turn to your right and tell the gentleman who is Minister of Agriculture who wrote and gave you the letters, showing it to the country, showing that at what stage those countries intervened to deal with their debt problem long before it reached the stage where Barbados now is. And in fairness to him, that letter was written, 18 months, 2 years ago? And the situation has gotten worse since then. Let us have a discussion about that in our 50th anniversary. If we want to be serious, let us have a discussion about the absence of banking and financial services to our people, and to the fact that it's not a problem peculiar to Barbados, but Barbados is more dependent, more in need of us resolving it, because Barbados is in greater need of triggering growth in this economy in order to help government stabilize its revenue, because 65% of our revenue comes from economic transactions. So you can't tax people to get more money. You have to grow the economy. You have to give people some breathing space. Let them help grow the economy and let the revenue come from that. It's not rocket science, but that's what we want to be discussing in the 50th year. We want to be discussing in the 50th year, why are we not in a position to open the windows to the nation and air the nation? Why is it only a handful of people that continue to appear to benefit from the bounty of this government and this government's favor? Those are the things. And forget this government. Let's say any government in the future, because the discussion has to be government and party neutral. What is the kind of Barbados we want? The Prime Minister says he wants this discussion. Let us have it. The Minister of Finance started by quoting the Right Excellent Errol Barrow in his speech in these estimates, and I thought that it might have reached that level. But bombast. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I've become accustomed to the fact that as a woman in politics, people like to make fun at you. But that is, I've done that for 25 years. So, I have become accustomed to it. And it's not, as wrong as it is with Hillary Clinton, it is as wrong for any woman on this side. But we have learned that to walk this road, this is what to expect, regrettably. And I hope and pray those who have daughters and nieces will have them participate in public life in Barbados in a way that will be not in any way tarnished by that kind of behavior and those kinds of comments. Mr. Speaker, sir, I have said all of this. I have said all of this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sir, I have said all of this, and I have not even got to the issue. I just dealt with the welfare cuts. I didn't get to the issue of school meals yet. I haven't got to the issue about the complaints by the parents and the children themselves about the absence of proper meals in school meals, and that is bread and bread and bread and this, that they're eating bread and flour the majority of the time. And you know, sir, when you make these points, the government genuinely feels that you're just making them for the sake of it. I want to point the government once again to its own data. And you know, when I read it, sir, it really shocked me, you know. I read it because you can't on the one hand be talking about the need for healthy lifestyles and the need for us to avoid diabetes and heart problems and strokes. And then when you check what people are able to buy and eat, they can't support a diet to support those healthy lifestyles. And the evidence is here for the government. Page 113 of the Social and Economic Report again. Do you know that the number of people getting strokes or cardiovascular events in this country increased by almost 50% between 2010 and 2012? By almost 50%. That's what this House needs to be talking about. Because, and it is not a glib thing, it's not that this government set out to say we want strokes to come. But if you don't ensure that people have access to a basic living, and you don't ensure that that basic living can buy food for a basic healthy diet, and encourage people, I agree that people have a duty also to plant more vegetables. And in the planting of more vegetables, the people then can also ensure that they can supplement their children's diet with those vegetables. But we have a problem. Now, it is also curious that these dates also coincide with the changes to the pharmaceutical service, the drug service. And we made the point that you're going to find that there were some instances where people were being deprived of a single tablet that could treat more than one condition. And therefore, many of the elderly people were not in a position to remember all the different tablets that they had to take, because somebody with diabetes invariably had hypertension, invariably had other problems. Now, it isn't a scare tactic. What is required is for the Minister of Health to update these figures down to 2015, because a 2014 report has no right stopping at 2012. And I believe the CEO of the hospital may well have given us some statistics, but it wasn't scare tactics when he talked about it. It wasn't scare tactics when the minister tells us how important chronic non-communicable diseases are. And I am saying to you that we have a duty to treat to this, because a 50% increase in strokes in a 2-year period in this country is out of the ordinary. I'm also saying to you that an increase in diabetes of 2,000 cases between 2010 and 2012, which is an 11-12% increase, is also of concern. And I come back then to the school meals issue. Because if we don't teach our children good nutritional habits from early and give them access to that, we inculcate in them the wrong habits at primary school. And I feel that the government can cut from other areas and make sure that the children are fed properly. I feel that the prisoners can be put to farm and produce all of the vegetables needed for the school meal service, so that our children can get access to vegetables in circumstances where money is tight to continue to procure them on a regular basis. Now the minister knows that there are other things that I could talk about, but I'm not going to, because I'm not being irresponsible. But I want to say this point, that what stops the prisoners from producing livestock and vegetables that can service the school meals department and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, geriatric hospital, the psychiatric hospital. And at the psychiatric hospital, I trust and pray that the money for this equipment will bring to an end the unacceptable situation of people having to wait 2 and 3 hours before they get breakfast in the morning. Breakfast at 10 and 11 o'clock, where they may be diabetic and therefore affected. Or people who are getting lunches at 3 and 4 o'clock because you have to bring the lunches from the geriatric hospital to the psychiatric hospital because the kitchen is taking more than 4 years to do because the government has not prioritized it in terms of the provision of resources. The same swiftness with which money was taken from the Housing Credit Fund against the law should be the same approach to have concluded the kitchen at the psychiatric hospital. But maybe the member for Christchurch South really don't have no pull in speaking about the wealth and health of this nation. He only has voice. But you know, sir, I turn to these figures not glibly, because as I said, these figures are produced by the Minister of Finance's ministry. The financial and economic report. And you know what was the most amazing statistic in here? Mr. Speaker, the most amazing statistic in this book. Do you understand that children didn't even come in? That between 2007 and 2014, almost 650 less children, babies, were born in this country. Almost in 2007, 3,537 babies. By 2014, less than 2,900 babies in this country. So that people are even making conscious decisions. And this is a trend that varies significantly from the previous years. People are making conscious decisions that they can't afford to bring babies in under this government, but things just too tough and too rough. And regrettably, that's in or out? In or out? And regrettably, sir, at the same time that the birth rate is dropping, at the same time that the live number of births has dropped by 650, almost 20%, would you believe, sir, that the number of deaths has regrettably increased? Barbadians, 370 more Barbadians are dying per year by 2014 than were dying in 2007. And sir, this is the human cost and tragedy of this adjustment. Less births, more deaths, more sicknesses. So when you ask me to assess these estimates, I can assess the numbers. I can show you that the Minister of Finance changed metrics and really ought not to have tried to fool people that the deficit is now 4.2%, because when you net out amortization...
I don't remember, you can't accuse anybody of trying to fool people. Please withdraw the...
I didn't hear the part, sir, sorry?
You said he was trying to, not to try to fool people. It's
I withdraw the remarks, fool people,
right,
sir.
fine.
The Minister of Finance reminded me
of David Copperfield,
sir. The Minister of Finance reminded me of David Copperfield by using different metrics to be able to tell us that a deficit gone down to 4.2% when he knows. I want to teach for everybody, tell everybody to do it for themselves, not me. That if the deficit on page 2, as he says, is 1.57 billion, net out the amortization from page 8, 1,000,006,000, get the 564 million and divide it by 8,921 and multiply it by 100 and see you get 6.3. But that's what this has been reduced to. I say to you, Mr. Speaker, that we have a problem in Barbados. I haven't gone into the water issues today because I am told that we're doing the Ministry of Agriculture and Water Resource Management in the heads. And the leader of the House is not in. And at that point, I will speak to the need not just to the long-term measures that the Minister of Agriculture has referred to, but also what we recognize as critical, which is the short-term measures of meeting the needs of the people from St. Lucie to St. Philip, from St. Lucie to St. Peter to St. Joseph, to St. Andrew to St. Thomas, parts of St. George, parts of St. Michael, parts of St. James, veritably the whole north of the island. And it's not something that, once again, there's a drought. But what we are saying is that we may have to work together to make sure that we can meet people's short-term needs in terms of access to water. I'm told that 1 or 2 districts are better off, but generally the problem subsists still in other areas. Indeed, in yesterday's paper, I saw the warning from the public health people that where people are storing water because they don't have access to running water, they need to make sure that they don't do it in a way that makes themselves vulnerable to Zika and the other mosquito-borne diseases. These are issues, and I trust that the minister, therefore, will update us in relation to what measures are being put in place, not just for the medium to long term, but as he knows from my letter, my immediate concern was also short term. And I don't believe that there's any politics in water management or water distribution, because without water, all of us will suffer and be miserable, okay? And it's a public health issue. I also look forward to the minister, when he is talking in agriculture, giving us an update on the sugar factory, because we have been told that this sugar factory was to be built now for the last year and a half, 2 years, but the bottom line is that sugar production has dropped to as low as it has, and we've heard and read in the paper the people from, I think, Inter Sugar Partnership asking and querying about government's contributions and commitments in order to be able to facilitate the start of the factory. Barbadians need to know, and therefore I look forward to us being informed. And Mr. Speaker, let me also state for the record, and I'm not going to be invidious, because it's going to hear it anyhow. The Barbados Labour Party left a cabinet decision for the construction of a sugar factory. We fundamentally disagree with the minister on location, because we still feel it should be Buckley and not Andrews. Our fundamental disagreement also is on the feedstock with River Tamarind. But I can't tell you that we did not agree to build a sugar factory in this country. Now, I therefore hope that the minister can also advise us, because ours was premised on participation also with Barbados Light and Power. And I would like to know whether Barbados Light and Power is still a critical partner, because we only produce cane to be able to feed a factory for 3 to 4 months of the year, and hence why they're looking at the River Tamarind. But the truth is, we felt that there should be other feedstock, and that Barbados Light and Power was critical in order to be able to procure the energy. Up comes Cahill, and then decides that it is going to produce energy at a price, electricity at a price way beyond anything that our sugar factory, and I don't know what the minister's sugar factory is due to produce it at, that bears no relationship whatsoever to what people pay for electricity in this country. Now, Cahill is not an on-budget matter, and therefore I will not treat to it in these estimates. But suffice it to say that I remain deeply disappointed, Mr. Speaker, that having filed questions in this Parliament, filed a resolution in this Parliament, calling on the Prime Minister and this government to produce the 3 agreements that have been signed by members of the Cabinet in the name of the people of Barbados, that since August last year, 7 months later, that we are to be treated with contempt in this country and in this Parliament by not being shown agreements that are floating around the net with stamps on it and signatures on it. No Barbadian should have to go to any social site to see who signed agreements with Cahill. No Barbadian should have to ask what these agreements meant in relation to Cahill. And I say to you that it is contemptuous to me for a leader of the opposition to legitimately ask and wait It is now 7 months, and those agreements have not been laid in this House, but yet they will lead to Barbadians having to incur through fees for the taking of garbage and the purchase of electricity by government from Cahill to a combined $4.8 billion over 30 years. It is the largest such expenditure any time ever contemplated in this country. And the people of Barbados deserve and must see the documents that have been signed in their name. I also say to you, sir, that it is of concern to me that the financing of the deficit will remain an issue. And the Ministry of Finance needs to also talk to the country about it, because Central Bank of Barbados cannot continue to print money to finance this ballooning deficit. It cannot. The Central Bank in this financial year reached in excess of $1 billion. $1 billion in government paper. And I say to you, Mr. Speaker, that it is playing fast and loose with this country's future for the central bank to be cavalierly printing money and doing it, sir, in a way that puts this country's financial health at risk. And you know, sir, what is even worse? That the central bank's administrative budget of 2015 admits and makes it clear that they deliberately intervened in the market. All the talk that they don't support reprofiling of debt, the central bank deliberately intervened in the market and undertook a policy of lowering the borrowing costs to government through bidding for the Treasury bills at 1%, rather than the 3 and 3.5% at which the Treasury bills were selling. Now, that is a case of doing one thing and saying another thing, because they did it as a deliberate policy decision to keep government's interest rates down, but then want to accuse anybody else who speaks about it as scaremongers. And that is why I say I have a problem, sir, with this country, with this government speaking in the way in which it is, rather than having a mature discussion. I'm also saying to you, sir, that where does the government contemplate that it will get the financing for the deficit? $1.495 billion. Central Bank already holding $1 billion in government paper. NIS already holding $3.2 billion. Commercial banks reaching their sovereign limits. Exposure for sovereign limits. But we continue, sir, on this merry path. I believe, sir, that we have reached a stage in this country where we really have, and Barbadians really have, to call to account across every sector. The media has to ask some difficult questions that it has not been asking. The IMF report, the financing of the deficit, the debt problem, the water problem, the perennial problem at the hospital. These are issues that ought to occupy our time. I believe, sir, that the labor movement and civil society, equally along with the private sector complains that the debt owed to them is 3 times what it was last time they spoke to the level of arrears owed by this government. And I already spoke to you about what the IMF conservatively estimated it at. The Minister of Finance glibly spoke about the refunds that were delivered so far for the year and last year, but has not told you that there are significant other refunds still owing to people, and that there are major companies in Barbados. One company alone owed over $6 million in VAT refunds. And these things are causing companies and businesses to come to the brink of insolvency because they're not getting the cooperation from the banks in terms of the flexibility to be able to help receive the finance that they need to run their enterprises. And I say to you, sir, that these things are of deep, deep, deep concern to us. But what do we get instead? The road program, I didn't talk about yet because we come into public transport. But when we come to that, all the talk, the minister wants to know where is the politics and where is the electioneering. Let's look at the fact that the Scotland District and Bridges continue to receive a paltry amount. But all of a sudden a road program is developed where senior ministers in the government are to receive the patronage from only certain communities appropriately chosen for these roads. I will talk also about the one that's been chosen for me that I didn't ask for, that is only to be found on a road in which there are two major concrete and construction companies and no citizen in St. Michael Northeast lives. Between Canewood, by the trees, and Lower Estate roundabout. But it's perhaps the heaviest trolled road for heavy equipment in the whole country because you got both ready mix and pre-conco using that road every day. But the people of Canewood Hill, whose road started since 2007, can't get the road finished. But this government is choosing to do a road under the IDB to fund for two concrete construction companies that will mash up the road just only because of the weight of the trucks that's using it. I'm not going to speak about that today. I'll wait for the heads. Believe you me. So that when this government says that it is not electioneering, believe you me, the electioneering is found in the distribution of what is put here. The electioneering is found in the independence vote budget. And you know the sad part is they can talk as much as they want. The average Bajan out there is already saying that this government is using independence as a platform for elections. Whether it is true or not, that is what each Barbadian out there believes. I'm sorry, the Minister of Health says it's the first body he hears it. Perhaps he needs to stop at the hospital to have his ears cleaned so he can hear it from people on his way home. Because it clearly is there. And Mr. Speaker, I say to Barbadians as I close, we have seen it all before. We have heard it all before. In 2008, they said from the platform, and they did posters, we will not lie, we will not cheat, we will not steal. Mr. Speaker, the less said about that, the better. In 2013, in the run-up, we will not send home any public sector workers. We will not charge fees at the University of the West Indies. And we will not sell off assets, state assets. Mr. Speaker, lo and behold, less than a year later, 3,000 public sector workers gone home. Less than a year later, decision and determination to sell assets, and in August 2013, the announcement that children going to the University of the West Indies would have to pay fees. We know the script. It has come over and over. And the Minister of Finance, a couple of weeks ago, says, wait for the tax reform, the tax benefits, the tax ease. That's coming later this year. Well, he can afford to say so after having bathed 62,000 workers with $60 million in allowances being taken away from them. 62,000 taxpayers lose the benefit of $60 million in allowances. Not to mention the consolidation tax that was to be temporary, that is being proceeded on for another year. And last year he said only one more year for that and the bank asset tax. Not a word today about that. No wage increases since 2008. So when he tells us about tax ease, but it's not something discretionary, it means that he may well now be understanding that if you don't put money back in people's pockets, you can't trigger growth, as the Labour Party told him last election. Then today he says, no fees at the QEH. Mr. Speaker, we have heard the protests the bold statements from all members of this government before. 2008 in opposition, 2012 and 13 for the 2013 election. And what we get today is just the modern day version of what went before. The beauty is Barbadians have determined trick me once, trick me twice, can't happen. And the bottom line is that Barbadians know how this government pitches the ball. Barbadians know what this government does on the eve of elections. And Barbadians are standing by in this year and next year for the use of the state resources and for the wild promises that will cause them to believe that all of a sudden manna will fall from heaven after 4 years of nothing but sufferation for the majority of people in this country. And all of a sudden, that more than 3 or 4 people will benefit from the bounty of this country. Well, I say to you, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to keep this government accountable. These estimates bear no relationship to the reality of what Barbadians are confronting. They bear no relationship to our reality in terms of our performance as an economy, and that they are serving the purpose, one thing, to be able to allow the minister to paint a rosy picture. We are here by virtue of a constitutional necessity, but we are not here because the minister has a credible program based on credible numbers that can deliver and ease the pressure and burden off of the majority of Barbadians. My only statement to Barbadians is that know always that BLP stands for a better life for our people for a real reason. Because we have shown through our policies that if you put the people of this country first, if you make sure that households and enterprises can in fact thrive, that the rest of the equation will fall into place. But no, for this government, it has been a completely different experience, matched with a set of rhetoric that is not reflected by their actions. I'm obliged to you, Mr. Speaker.